On Christmas Day 1991, the government of the Soviet Union led by President Mikhail Gorbachev was just 8 days old. In fact, it was so new that it hadn't even been officially registered, and yet within these 8 days this superpower would suddenly collapse in one of the most dramatic political collapses in modern history. And in this video, we're going to look at how and why this happened. We'll start off with the final days of the ussr and then zoom out to see the bigger picture. As always, this is a super quick summary of a very complex topic, so let's get started. Gorbachev came to power in 1985 when the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. The economy was stagnant, the political system was corrupt, and the military was overextended. But instead of trying to fix these problems, Gorbachev decided to address the one issue he felt was at the heart of all of these problems, namely the lack of openness and transparency in the Soviet political system. His idea was that if he opened up the Soviet Union to some Western ideas, then these issues would be resolved. For example, he introduced glasnost, which was a policy of increased openness and transparency in the Soviet Union, and he also introduced perestroika, which was an economic restructuring meant to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy. Now, opening up the Soviet Union did indeed bring about positive change. For example, the media was finally allowed to openly criticize the government for the first time in decades, but it also had a negative side effect, namely, it unleashed forces that were beyond Gorbachev's control. For example, as the Soviet Union became more open, nationalist and religious groups began to re-emerge. They had been repressed by the Soviet regime for decades, and now they began to agitate for independence. At the same time, the economic reforms that Gorbachev introduced failed to improve the Soviet economy and instead created massive shortages of basic goods. Suddenly, people all across the Soviet Union were questioning the system that had been in place since 1922. Was it possible that this way of life, this way of organizing society, this way of doing politics, was it really all there was? By 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed imminent. But the question was, who would take charge once the hammer came down? Would it be Gorbachev or someone else? Well, as it turned out, neither. Instead, it was a relatively unknown 61-year-old Russian leader named Boris Yeltsin. He was the leader of the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union, and he was the first to declare that the Soviet Union was finished. On December 1991, he met with the leaders of two other Soviet republics, namely Ukraine and Belarus, and together they declared that a new Commonwealth of independent states had been formed. 3 days later, the leaders of 9 more Soviet republics met with Yeltsin, and together they signed the Belavasia Accords, which basically dissolved the ussr and replaced it with this new Commonwealth of independent states. 8 days later, on Christmas Day 1991, the Soviet Union as we know it ceased to exist. If you want to learn more about this fascinating topic, we've made a longer video on our channel.